They called it county lines, but what this gang built was closer to a cartel. 13 separate drug lines, over 1,400 customer contacts, and tens of thousands of text messages marketing heroin and crack cocaine across the East Midlands and beyond, from Nottinghamshire to Derbyshire, Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, and as far north as Aberdeen. It was a modern criminal machine, run like a business, fueled by intimidation, and packaged with the glamour of drill rap and designer labels. This was no ragtag street crew. Led by figures like Jeffit Figula and C4 Cube, the gang was tightly structured, technologically advanced, and deeply exploitative. Children as young as 16 were used to traffic drugs. Addicts were coerced into becoming couriers, and violence, or the threat of it, underpinned every transaction. They flaunted their wealth, Rolexes, Rolls-Royces, Dom Perignon, in social media clips and music videos, boasting about their dominance while police built their case. What followed was a sprawling multi-force investigation, one of the largest county lines crackdowns in Nottinghamshire police history. And in 2025, justice finally caught up with them. 12 men jailed for a combined 130 years. A drug empire dismantled. This is the story of the gang that marketed misery and masked it in music. The roots of the operation began deep within Nottingham's urban undercurrent, a city with a long history of gang activity, but rarely on the industrial scale this crew achieved. At its centre stood Jeffit Figula, a 29-year-old described by police as a commanding presence who acted as both organiser and enforcer. Figula didn't just oversee deals, he managed strategy, distribution, and violence. His ambition was clear: control not just Nottingham, but every line feeding into and out of the East Midlands. Alongside him was C4 Cube, also 29, a man as interested in appearances as he was in profit. Cube flaunted his wealth with social media posts showing luxury cars, expensive champagne, and designer watches. But behind the filters lay a cold, calculated criminal, one who kept handwritten notes outlining his goal to earn £20,000 a week from the trade. He wasn't just selling drugs, he was building a brand. Recruitment was key. They targeted the young, the impressionable, and the desperate, many underage, many already vulnerable. A 16-year-old boy was placed under the control of gang member Ramon Campbell and used as a full-time courier. These weren't one-off cases. They were a systematic feature of the group's model. As their structure grew, roles became clearly defined. Members like Camel Manto operated multiple lines despite arrests. Others like Terrell Patterson and Samuel Grant ran daily logistics from key Nottingham locations, overseeing packaging and coordinating runners. This wasn't chaotic crime, it was enterprise. What made this group so dangerous wasn't just what they sold, but how they operated. They studied market demand, maintained consistent supply, and enforced order through violence. By the time police took notice, they weren't dealing with a street gang. They were confronting a regional narcotics network with aspirations of national reach. Figula's home became a focal point for police raids. Inside, investigators found ammunition, drugs, and a live-firing weapon. Proof that the gang's influence wasn't just financial, it was militarized. The operation had begun with ambition, but it was fast evolving into something far more organized, far more entrenched, and far more difficult to dismantle. What began as a localized operation in Nottingham soon transformed into a multi-county distribution empire. At its height, the gang controlled 13 distinct drug lines, each one a dedicated mobile number used to send out marketing texts, take orders, and coordinate deliveries of crack cocaine and heroin. These weren't burner phones passed between users, they were business tools, manned around the clock, stocked with SIMs, and armed with promotional messages like "best gear in town" or "2-for-1 deals tonight." Police discovered over 33,000 marketing messages had been sent from these lines. The scale was staggering. Through just these mobile numbers, the gang maintained a digital connection to more than 1,400 customer contacts, many of them addicts, all of them vulnerable. The messages weren't just functional. They were designed to hook, using street slang and urgency to drive demand. It was textbook marketing, repurposed for narcotics. The lines stretched far. From Hucknall and Mansfield to Ripley, Ilkeston, Grantham, Long Eaton, Corby and Spalding, all the way up to Aberdeen. Each line had a line holder, a logistics manager, and street-level runners. One defendant, God Praise Bowen, just 25, was operating two of the gang's most profitable lines. Another, Gail Land, was labelled a quartermaster, overseeing the daily movement of drugs to dealers and cash back to higher-ups. They didn't just distribute, they produced. Crack houses were used to cut cocaine with paracetamol and caffeine, stretching supply, increasing profit, and dangerously altering potency. Bailey Reed, 25, was in charge of managing up to 2 kilos of bulking powder, a practice that made the drugs even more harmful while inflating the gang's margins. Their communication system mirrored that of a legitimate enterprise. Schedules were kept, roles were enforced, payments were tracked. In some areas, local dealers even paid the gang wholesale rates to access their supply, effectively turning this outfit into a regional wholesaler. All of this was maintained through digital infrastructure. Messaging apps, encrypted phones, handwritten ledgers, and social media clout helped keep the brand alive. The gang understood that controlling a market wasn't just about fear. It was about reliability, image, and omnipresence. But that level of scale brought exposure. With each new line, each expansion into another postcode, their digital footprint grew. And with every SIM card registered, every line activated, they left behind a traceable path, one that Nottinghamshire police were quietly beginning to map. In the underworld of county lines drug trafficking, power is maintained not just by supply and demand, but by fear and spectacle. This gang understood that dynamic intimately. From the start, they wielded power through calculated coercion and strategic branding, a combination of street violence and digital bravado that kept customers loyal, rivals in check, and recruits eager. Jeffit Faikula, armed and unafraid to use violence, enforced the group's hierarchy through a mixture of threat and presence. Police raids on properties linked to him uncovered a live firearm and ammunition, underscoring just how far he was willing to go to defend his empire. Faikula was not simply a supplier, he was a commander who ruled through intimidation. Others like Ramon Campbell and C4 Cube were equally instrumental in maintaining the gang's grip. Campbell was convicted of using a 16-year-old boy to run drugs, not out of desperation, but as a deliberate, profit-driven decision. The child lived under his control, manipulated and placed directly into harm's way. Cube, meanwhile, fronted the image of success: champagne, designer clothes, expensive jewellery, and boasts of weekly £20,000 profits. His public persona served as both lure and warning: flaunt the rewards, remind others who's at the top. The group's control extended into every layer of their operation. Couriers were monitored closely, with lineholders like Terrell Patterson and Samuel Grant coordinating shifts, routes, and drop points. Missed hand-ins or late responses weren't tolerated. The logistics ran with the efficiency of a delivery firm, but failure carried consequences far beyond a missed bonus. Social media played a sinister role in how they maintained influence. Rap videos, some featuring gang members themselves, showcased luxury cars, stacks of cash, and subtle threats embedded in lyrics. These weren't just for entertainment, they were propaganda, carefully crafted to glorify the lifestyle while simultaneously warning off challengers. Knife carrying was routine. La Juan Fogo, the youngest adult member, was regularly armed despite his age. He ran a line in Sutton in Ashfield and helped produce crack on site. His involvement symbolized the group's recruitment strategy: target youth, offer status, and embed them quickly in roles with real responsibility. Control was also psychological. Customers were promised quick delivery, consistent quality, and anonymity. Recruits were promised money, power, and belonging. But behind the glamour and rhythm, the reality was cold and transactional. The group used people and discarded them just as easily, and while they moved like a business, they enforced like a gang. For a while, the gang moved with clinical precision, their communication systems tight, their logistics streamlined, and their digital presence carefully curated. But beneath the gloss and swagger, the cracks had already begun to form. Behind the designer tracksuits and bullet points in notebooks about profits, police were watching, listening, mapping. The first red flags came from patterns. Local officers in Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, and Lincolnshire began noticing the same style of drug marketing messages circulating across different towns, bulk texts, all from similarly structured numbers, offering crack and heroin with coded language. In isolation, they looked like low-level dealing, but together they formed the skeleton of a much larger machine. It was Nottinghamshire Police that made the initial breakthrough. Tasked with dismantling county lines networks under Operation Reacher, detectives began cross-referencing seized phones, intercepted calls, and financial movements. The same names kept cropping up, the same numbers, the same routes. Slowly, the scale of what they were dealing with came into view. The gang's digital overconfidence also helped. Their use of handwritten logs, social media boasting, and unencrypted marketing texts gave police all the threads they needed to pull. Surveillance teams tracked vehicle movements. Raids were coordinated across addresses linked to key members. When they moved in, they found crack production kits, burner phones, and cash stashes. The structure that once looked so secure began to fracture. Perhaps the most telling sign of vulnerability was internal complacency. Despite arrests and warnings, several members continued operating openly. Camel Manto was caught multiple times, yet remained involved with supply lines. Cube continued to flash wealth online even while on bail. Their belief that they were beyond reach became a critical weakness, and the law used it. Interviews with vulnerable youths and recovering addicts gave police further insight into how the gang recruited and retained. What emerged was a portrait of an enterprise held together not by loyalty or strategy, but by fear and illusion. Once exposed to sunlight, the illusion began to evaporate, and as each address was raided, each line dismantled, the gang's grip loosened. This wasn't just a police operation, it was a pressure campaign. And under pressure, even the most polished facades begin to crack. What had looked untouchable in music videos and bulk texts now looked exposed, and the countdown to arrests had already begun. When Nottinghamshire Police struck, they did so with precision, the culmination of years of surveillance, intelligence gathering, and coordination with forces across the Midlands and beyond. What had begun as a fragmented map of drug lines and burner phones had coalesced into a full-scale criminal enterprise. Now, it was time to dismantle it, piece by piece. Raids took place in Nottingham Mansfield, Sutton in Ashfield, Derby, Leicester, and even as far north as Aberdeen. Dozens of addresses were hit simultaneously in the early hours. Officers in full tactical gear breached doors, seized electronics, bagged evidence, and made arrests. The timing was crucial. Many of the suspects were active, messages still being sent, deals still being coordinated, when the knock came. Inside the properties, police found everything they needed: live ammunition, weapons, hundreds of wraps of heroin and crack cocaine, dozens of mobile phones, many still warm from recent use. Marketing notebooks listing profits, contacts, and goals, some reading like business strategy documents. In one case, officers found bulk cutting agents ready for processing, along with digital scales and packaging materials. Perhaps most chilling were the clues of coercion, signs that vulnerable individuals, including minors, had been used to stash drugs or manage distribution. One 16-year-old was found to have been living under the control of a senior gang member, ferrying drugs daily and exposed to the constant threat of violence. The strength of the case lay not just in what was found, but in how much it linked. Every seized phone fed into a network map, every address tied back to one of the 13 drug lines, and every suspect's role, from quartermasters to street runners, was clearly evidenced through messages, ledgers, and witness testimony. This was not a crew of amateurs. It was a structured syndicate that had grown too fast, too far, and far too public. But that growth had been their undoing. With every new line came more exposure. With every flex on social media, another breadcrumb for investigators to follow. In total, 12 men were arrested and charged. Their empire, built on fear, addiction, and manipulation, had finally collapsed. But the true impact of the takedown was not just in the arrests. It was in the disruption of an enterprise that had reached deep into communities, corrupted youth, and normalized danger. The cleanup had begun, and justice at last was on the front foot. On the 5th of June, 2025, Nottingham Crown Court became the stage for the final chapter of one of the most significant county lines prosecutions in East Midlands history. 12 men stood accused, not of isolated incidents, but of managing a complex drug empire built on exploitation, violence, and high-level coordination. As Judge Mark Watson delivered his sentences, the weight of years of damage and community suffering came into sharp focus. At the top of the hierarchy was 29-year-old Jeffit Fikula, found guilty of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and multiple firearms offences, including possession of a loaded weapon with intent to endanger life. Fikula was handed a 21-year sentence. His role as enforcer and organiser placed him squarely at the centre of the gang's violent infrastructure. Next came C4 Cube, also 29, sentenced to 15 years. His role went beyond operations. He became the gang's mouthpiece, flaunting its wealth and influence through social media and music videos. Despite arrests and bail conditions, he continued offending, demonstrating a complete disregard for the law. Ramon Campbell, 28, was jailed for 14 years. Not only did he manage a key line, he was found guilty of exploiting a 16-year-old as a courier. The courts condemned him for endangering a child for personal gain. Sentences ranged from 6 years and 4 months for persistent offender Camel Manto to 20 months for lower-level participants like Lajwan Fogo. Terrell Patterson, Samuel Grant, and Godpraise Bowen received significant sentences for running lines and handling logistics. All were judged to have played crucial roles in maintaining the gang's day-to-day business. In total, the court handed down a combined 130 years in prison. Judge Watson said, "This was a highly organized and deeply exploitative operation. You marketed misery, you profited from addiction, and you manipulated the vulnerable, including children, for your own ends. The impact of your crimes will be felt by communities long after today." Detective Inspector Luke Todd praised the multi-agency effort that brought the case together. "This gang is responsible for untold damage across our region. Today's sentencing is a victory not just for law enforcement, but for every victim, whether coerced into dealing or trapped in addiction." The empire was gone. The message was clear. In the modern drugs trade, no amount of marketing or firepower can shield you from justice forever.